My 27-year-old wife, Debbie, wanted a divorce from me. Why, you ask? That's a long story. Let me tell you all about it. For some context, both of us met and got married when we were very young. Not quite poor, but still struggling in our careers nonetheless. Both of us decided together that instead of working odd jobs, we would start our own business. So we started running a food truck in lieu of our own business. Those were really tough days, requiring a lot of hard work and demanding even more time. Later on, Debbie decided that she wasn't up for providing any of those. It all became too much for her, so she just stopped working and started staying at home. She expected me to work and provide for her. And I did, like any husband would have. But things started to take a worse turn from then on because I had started giving even more time to the business in order to set it up. And Debbie, being Debbie, was not a fan of me working late hours either. She always complained about me being always busy and not giving her any time. She also got mad when I was not able to give her the lifestyle that she wanted at the time. So we started having little problems here and there, but I paid them no heed, considering that I was mostly away from home, working and hoping that one day my hard work would finally pay off. And it did. With time, I had progressed from one food truck to 2 food trucks, then from 2 food trucks to 3 food trucks, and then to a restaurant. And now, I had just opened another restaurant. It was relatively new and in a very prime location. I had a trusted employee of mine, Ethan, who helped run it in my stead. Ethan was one of the cooks in my first restaurant, the first one to join me, and he was amazing. He soon turned into a friend, and now I had started trusting him with my life, as well as my business. In fact, I had even let him live in my house for some time when he had lost his apartment in a fire and was going through some rather difficult times. By the time the business had started taking off, I thought it was time for me and Debbie to work on our marriage. We were always fighting whenever we were together by that point. I would often see her later and hear her screams and shouts first whenever I entered the house. Our lives were slowly turning into a nightmare, and there was no waking up from that. But I stayed a bit hopeful. I thought now that I had some time on my hands and we were living the luxurious life that Debbie always wanted, we could stop fighting and start figuring our shit out. But by then, the damage was already done. She was having an affair behind my back, and the person she was cheating on me with was one of my cooks, Ethan. The worst thing was that I had found out when I had walked in on them, making out in one of the deep freezers. That had really bothered me the most. I'd seen red in my rage at seeing them together like that. And them, they were so caught up with each other they hadn't even noticed me coming in there. I retreated from there quietly, still shaken and shocked at the scene I had walked in on. But my shock was replaced with the quiet anger that never really left me when I was with either of them, Debbie or Ethan. I did not confront them as I wanted to see how far they would take it and how long it would take for them to come clean about it. They didn't come clean about it. I, however, was served a divorce notice soon afterwards. The mentioned cause for divorce? My lack of time and effort for Debbie. I laughed outright at that and accepted it, starting to look for my own divorce attorney to finalize everything. Then began a long and tiring process of our divorce that spanned well over a year. There were many things to finalize, like the ownership of the house and some of the other properties we had acquired over time, as well as the simple custody of our pet cat and so on and so forth. It was all really difficult and time-consuming, but even more than that, it was just draining me out. Soon thereafter, we started living separately, but even till then, there were no mentions of Ethan whatsoever. By then, I'd figured that finally the divorce would get finalized soon, We hadn't lived together for over a year now, but sometimes I still met her, once or twice a month, for divorce proceedings as well as business dealings. We had decided to sell off both the restaurants that we had started together at the beginning of our marriage and split the money we would make from that. No matter how unfair the deal was in my favor, it was the only deal we could agree upon and proceeded with the divorce. Besides, I too wanted a fresh start in life without her name attached to anything in it, so I agreed. But seeing the business flourishing, especially the second restaurant that I had opened recently, Debbie changed her mind. She wanted to take over the second restaurant instead of selling it. She was sure that she could make the restaurant work, run it even better, in fact. When I registered my skepticism at that, she said that she would let Ethan run it, and she would control the marketing side of the business. Just to make sure the business is doing okay, you know? The reason she gave me for letting Ethan run the business. And they still hadn't told me about their dirty little secret. And I still hadn't told them that. I already knew about it. I was waiting for the perfect opportunity to reveal it to them, when they would least expect it, when it would cause the maximum amount of damage, as much damage as it had caused me at the very least. By then, I'd understood that it was all a ploy, and that asshole Ethan wanted to take my restaurant away from me as he had taken away my wife. Like hell I would let him. Let them. I had put my blood, sweat, and tears in building up my restaurants. I was never going to just hand it over to those traitors. No way in hell. Both restaurants, as well as the 3 mobile food trucks, were estimated to be worth a total of $3 million, and she wanted me to walk away with merely $300,000 and pay all the divorce attorneys. I couldn't even wrap my head around the audacity she had to even think that this was the right distribution of our assets. I had worked my ass off, working and building up a business, and she wanted me to give it all up? I was beyond pissed at her. After all the foolishness my wife was putting me through, and combined with the stress from the business, my health was also starting to fail. It was a wonder my health had lasted as long as it did. But I really needed to get away from her and all the mess so that I could get my head on straight and get better. But it was proving more and more difficult. Even when we were almost divorced now, she still managed to pop up somewhere in my life and still managed to disrupt it somehow. I had had enough of her, really. But she still was everywhere. On December 27th, Debbie and I celebrated Christmas along with my family as well as hers. We always gathered together in our hometown during the holidays and celebrated the festival together. And even though Debbie and I were technically divorcing and not even living together, we still made it to the gatherings together because our family at the time did not know the full story of our broken marriage. None of them knew the shit she was putting me through, and so we faked our marriage around them until our divorce would be final. It was a bloody nightmare pretending to be okay with each other and acting all nice towards one another. All the while I wanted to bang my head somewhere, or more preferably, bang her head somewhere. It was a long, long day. We had just left from my mother's house after Christmas dinner, and we decided to take the backcountry road to the next town. It was getting a bit late at night, and Debbie was a bit worried about traveling back in the dark, as my family lived deep in the woods of South Carolina. But I was born and raised in these deep woods, and I knew them like the back of my hand. I wanted better things in my life, so I decided to leave it all behind and start my life back in Atlanta, Georgia. But that doesn't mean that I had forgotten a thing about my hometown. So I decided to make the drive anyway, and she had to come along with me. We were about 4 hours away from Atlanta, passing through this small town, Tacoma, a nice town that had only about 2,000 residents living there. It was a light bit after midnight, and we still had about 2 hours drive left until we hit the main highway. Debbie was putting up another argument with me about how she was in the right in asking for the restaurant and all that shit. as I was going through the channels finding something to listen to. I really just wanted to tune her out and focus on the music instead. Anything but her annoying chattering. As I was busy with the radio trying to find something worth listening to, I started to take my eyes off the road. That's when Debbie yelled at me to look out. I quickly turned my eyes back to the road, and the first thing I saw was a large creature stepping out onto the road from the woods surrounding it. It snatched a dead raccoon that was lying on the road, roadkill probably, and turned back towards the forest. The creature was out for a brief moment, but that brief moment is just enough for a driver to lose their concentration, along with their shit. One such driver was behind the wheel of a yellow conversion van. It swiveled abruptly as soon as the driver got back to his senses, trying to avoid hitting the car in front of him. In his haste, the driver crossed over the lane and came right into mine. It all happened so suddenly that I couldn't even push the brakes, and neither could the driver of the van, apparently. Both our cars collided with a loud bang. The force of the collision flipped us both over. Our Jeep came to a screeching halt after turning over once, some feet off the road. It left both Debbie and I mostly unharmed, save for some scratches and bruises here and there. The van proved to be not that lucky, however. I could see it roll over a couple times before landing in the ditch by the side of the road, at the right foot of the forest. The creatures inside the forest had heard the intruders as well, it seemed. They all started coming out of the woods soon after the commotion. Debbie and I removed our seatbelts, trying to straighten ourselves. My beloved Jeep had taken most of the brunt of the fall, leaving us unscathed, but the Jeep itself was a bit worse for wear. I groaned at the sight of my broken Jeep and instinctively looked over to see the damage the van had been served. What I saw instead was that the van was full of teenagers, and those teenagers were screaming bloody murder because they could see the large creature stepping out from the trees once again, growling and showing his large canines, and it was heading straight towards the van, all the while staring at them. Several people had stopped their cars on the roads with an intention to help us all probably, but everyone was now full of fear and too nervous to get out of their vehicles and lend a helping hand. And so was I, so I stayed put in my Jeep, just watching and waiting for the scene to fully unfold. The creature snatched one of the boys from the van and dragged him off into the dark woods. The boy kept kicking and screaming as he was dragged along by the creature. He started thrashing around when he could do nothing else, still keeping up the struggle until he was fully enclosed in the darkness of the forest. We could all still hear the teenager putting up a fight with the large monster initially, but soon we could tell that he had lost the battle because the only sound we could hear anymore was the sound of flesh being torn apart and the breaking of bones. And then there was also the stench of blood overtaking the air. Everyone stayed rooted to their place, frozen in shock, hearing the screams and growls until there were no more. As soon as the sounds inside the woods stopped, the commotion outside the woods began. The yells and the shouts and pleas of help. People suddenly came alive once again, as if knowing that the creature was coming back, looking for his next victim. At that point, most of the vehicles that had stopped, either in curiosity or really wanting to help us, started up once again and sped away, leaving us to our own devices, especially the van filled with teenagers. They were going to be the next target, and they were just outside of the forest, in direct line of attack from the creature. And the prediction came true. The creature emerged once again in search of more food. But this time around, it was not just one creature. It had brought along some company. 4 more monstrous-sized creatures stepped out from the tree line with him, growling at us, all baring their teeth and showing their fangs, deadly sharp, dripping in blood. They looked around, spotting many targets but wondering which one to choose first. 2 of them started heading towards the sparse cars that were still parked on the roadside. Some brave souls, or maybe just plain foolish ones, still stood there, waiting to see what would happen next. But their bravery did not survive the arrival of the new monsters, far more in number now. They all zoomed away, leaving the road empty for the time being. This enraged the creatures even more. Seeing their food get away from them drove them even more mad. They growled in fury and turned towards the nearest target, the van filled with the teenagers. 15 minutes later, and the only thing that could be heard in the night was just screaming, yelling, and growling, continuously going back and forth as more and more creatures started running out from the woods, attacking the van as the teenagers crowded over the passenger side. 7 creatures attacked the van at once, pulling everyone out. They grabbed all the passengers from whatever body part they could reach first, be it their legs or arms, their throats or their heads. No one was safe from the bloody debacle. They immediately started ripping into the teenagers as soon as they got their hands on them. They were feeding off their bodies, eating them alive like a cheap buffet, leaving broken bones, mangled carcasses, and streams of blood in their wake. It was a sight so gory that a weak-hearted person might not even survive just seeing it. It was as fascinating as it was horrifying. Debbie and I just sat there, shocked and transfixed at the massacre happening in front of us. We were abruptly brought out of our stupor when 2 of the large creatures started shaking our Jeep, trying to get to us both. I hadn't even realized that they had been approaching, and judging by the startled gasp Debbie let out at the sudden intrusion, she hadn't either. Her shocked gulp, however, quickly turned into terrified shrieks when one of the creatures grabbed Debbie by her leg and started to pull her from the Jeep. She screamed and started lashing around violently in her seat, trying to get the monster to let go, but to no avail. The creature had an iron grasp upon her. Soon, she realized that trying to fight off the creature was a losing battle, so she turned to thrashing around and trying to grasp anything in the surrounding that she could hold on to. And there was nothing she could hold on to within the Jeep, except for me. I could tell the moment she realized that the only one around that could help her was me. She turned to me then, begging me to help her, pleading, crying, trying to reach out to me. I looked out the back window at the creature. The creature was looking right back, right at me, as if he was asking me for permission to take her. And I nodded my head. Before he could take her, though, I turned to her and saw her looking up at me, still begging me to save her. I knew that was the perfect time for the big reveal. I leaned closer to her, smirking inside in delight and relish, and whispered in her ear, "You will never take anything from me. I won't let you, ever. And don't worry about your little boyfriend, Ethan. I'll take care of that asshole too, when I get back." I moved away from her and saw her face as realization dawned on her. She stopped struggling as she gave me a look of utter disbelief and shock, her eyes as wide as saucers. I smirked outright then, letting her know just how much I was enjoying the fate I was putting her through. In the next moment, with a clean, precise motion, I pushed her face out of the Jeep and watched as the creatures descended upon her like starved animals. They dragged her deep into the dark woods, her face never to be seen again. I stayed, staring until she completely disappeared from my sight, and then turned towards the steering wheel of my Jeep, igniting it once again. There were no creatures surrounding my Jeep or trying to harm me as I started it again and drove off on my way. As I said before, I know these woods like the back of my hand.